And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello again, this is Drew Perkins, the Director of Professional Development here at TeachThought, and I hope you're staying safe and sane in these trying times. There certainly seems to be an emotional and cognitive and physical toll that social isolation can exact on somebody. Hopefully soon we'll be back to some sense of normalcy. It'll be interesting to see how that will affect schools and teaching and learning and just regular interaction, but we do hope you're practicing social isolation and being smart about your exposure to people who may or may not be carrying the coronavirus. As a reminder, we're now offering online workshops for those schools who are looking to shift to an online PD environment. You may not be ready to do that quite yet, but those things will be there when you are ready. Those come in two different options, which are public registration, where any teacher can sign up for any individual workshop that we're offering. And right now we're offering project-based learning and creating a culture of inquiry. Those are limited to small cohorts of 8. So they will start May 4th and go for 4 weeks with twice weekly meetings. And then if you are a school leader and looking to engage a school cohort, we can design that work. Could be project-based learning and inquiry or any of our professional development areas, and we can design the dates and the work to meet your needs specifically. So you'll want to get in touch with us by going to wegrowteachers.com and finding the online workshops tab up along the top, and from there you can submit a request info form and I'll get in touch with you. We also recently engaged with the Right Question Institute folks and Warren Berger, the author of A More Beautiful Question and a couple of other books on questioning, one which is just out on questioning in the classroom. But we did an online Zoom forum with almost 400 people from around the world, some of you who we've worked with before and others who we have not. But it was really interesting to have that discussion with those folks and see the chat comments and questions that surfaced in that 1 hour session. If you'd like to view that or listen to it, you can do that by going to wegrowteachers.com and click on the free COVID resources tab. It's archived there as well as a PDF of the chat, and in that chat box you'll see some links and some suggestions and some really very interesting and beautiful questions. So hopefully that is helpful. We look to do some other things like that with some other partner organizations, so stay tuned for that, and if you're not on our mailing list, you may want to jump on that as well. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Caitlin Sweetapple, who is the Director of Education at Shrub Oak International School, which is a private boarding and day school that focuses on autistic education. I wanted to talk with Caitlin because I think there are certainly lots of teachers who are working with students who are on the autism spectrum in regular education classrooms and almost certainly in non-regular education classrooms. So we touched on things like differentiation and how that looks in their classrooms and some takeaways for regular classrooms and some of the ways in which they think about treating students with presuming competence and really the importance of building relationships. We talked about the ways in which they might demonstrate understanding with limited capacity and how we might think about doing that with regular ed students as well. And we talked about the importance of wait time and a little bit more clear definition of Asperger's and autism, and then leaned into the online learning environment in which many of us find ourselves and some tips for teachers that I think, again, are applicable to regular education schools and teachers around the country and around the world. And finally leaned into some of the professional development and leadership pieces on supporting their teachers and how that might look different for their teachers versus regular ed teachers, again, with some parallels and some takeaways that she has learned in her transition from being a teacher to ed leadership. As always, I hope the podcast episode is helpful and useful in your work to better prepare students for the modern world. Caitlin, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you on. We're going to talk about teaching and learning, and especially with autistic students and your experience with that and the work that you're doing with the school called Shrub Oak. But let's give our listeners a little bit of background on Shrub Oak and the work that you're doing and kind of how you describe the work that you're doing.
Hi, Drew. Well, first, thank you so much for having me on. So I am the Director of Education at Shrub Oak International School. We are a day and boarding school for students on the autism spectrum. We have a bunch of different programs at Shrub Oak International School. So like I said, we have a day and boarding program, but within that, our education programs are broken up into the core program and also our founders program. So our core program is broken up into two different sections. We have a skills and achievement group of students who are focusing more on daily living skills, life skills, vocational skills, are out in the community working on internships, and getting a little bit more support in their academic work. And then we have students in our diploma-bound program who are seeking a high school diploma and looking to go to some type of post-secondary education. And again, that looks different for every student. And then we also have our Founders program, which is a program where our students get one-to-one support throughout the day, afternoon, and on weekends in our residential program, and are really getting maximum level support in activities of daily living and life skills, sensory integration, communication skills. And then we also have two other programs. We have our elementary program, which works with students on all ends of the spectrum from about 7 years old to 13 years old. And then we also have a post-secondary program. So we actually work with students up until age 30. So after 21, students can join our post-secondary program for students who need a little bit more support in trying to figure out what kind of post-secondary education they're interested in, or what kind of job they would like to do, and get a little bit more into internship skills and also skills on just navigating life post 21 as far as independence is concerned. So we have a broad range of programs that work with students on the autism spectrum, as well as our day program, as well as our residential program. So it's a nice little program. We're located in northern Westchester in New York State, and are on 127 acres of land. So we have a wide range of land to do a lot of different really cool things with our students.
Yeah, interesting. And how did you get into this kind of work in teaching and learning? Because it's certainly a specialty.
Yeah, I've definitely always had a pull towards education in general. I myself have always liked being in school. So kind of knew from a very young age that I wanted to be a teacher. I actually started as a physical education teacher. And then shortly in doing my student teaching program, I started working in an adapted physical education program, and I fell in love instantly. So really from that moment is when I kind of really knew I wanted to work with students on the autism spectrum. It always really gave me sort of a purpose in my practice. And it was shortly after that I started I moved to Europe and was doing a program in Europe where I was doing my master's in adapted physical education. So I got a lot of experience over in Belgium and Ireland working with students on the autism spectrum, and then recently started a doctorate program in educational leadership. So kind of worked my way up. I started as a teaching assistant, teacher, and I'm now directed in the education program at Shrub Oak. So I've had a lot of neat experiences working with students on the autism spectrum and their families. So really it was kind of from the moment I started student teaching and working with students on the spectrum, I really had a pull towards it and haven't really looked back.
So one of the things that strikes me about your experience is the international pieces, and I'm wondering if you can speak to, or if there are any substantial differences. I know, or at least my perception is, if I'm correct on this, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there has been in the past, I don't know, I want to say 5 to 10 years, maybe I'm wrong about that, but sort of a redefinition or the way that we think about autism and define it, and Asperger's and those kinds of things has shifted in some ways. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that, and then also how that, if indeed it does, look different in different countries and how they think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of a twofold question. So basically, the autism world and autism education in particular has really shifted over. And you're right about the past 5-10 years. Students on the autism spectrum used to just be worked in sort of this behavioral model where just looking at behavior modification. And there's been a lot of research recently in the past couple of years about other forms of working with students on the autism spectrum. So working with students from a developmental model as well as a behavioral model, and then also in conjunction, really seeing the student first rather than the behaviors that they're exhibiting. So that's sort of changed. And then as far as working with students internationally and nationally, I think it all depends on the country. Where I was in Ireland at the time, it was the only school for students on the autism spectrum. So if you were in a different county in Ireland, you weren't necessarily granted the same opportunities for your child if you were in the county that I was working in. So that was definitely a barrier. I think we're sort of lucky in the sense in the United States where as the diagnosis is increasing of students on the autism spectrum, as are the programs for students on the autism spectrum, which is really nice. We do at Shrub Oak, we have students who have come internationally who have never been in school before, or have only been in, there was only one program in their country available to them. So we've been able to provide students internationally with opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily have had if they had stayed in their home country, which has been a really neat experience. And it's really nice for the families to be able, it's a big thing, as I'm sure you can imagine, moving across the world to educate your child. And obviously that's not an opportunity that's available for everybody, but for the families that it has been an availability for, it's been really neat to provide them with those services and with the appropriate education that they might not have had anywhere else.
Right. Well, it strikes me a couple things that are really important in this conversation is to think about, like you said, there's the opportunity to engage in a school like Shrub Oak that focuses on this is not available to anybody, just a sheer fact of size and not to mention location and all of those things. But as we think about how do we help teachers better prepare students for the modern world, thinking about what are some things that teachers who are not with Shrub Oak can take away from to helping teacher or for helping students in their classrooms, and most of them would not likely have profoundly autistic students in their classrooms. They might have mildly autistic, or I don't know how you distinguish Asperger's. I'm curious as well about that. But what are some of those things, and especially through a lens of differentiated instruction? So what are some of those things that teachers can take away, or suggestions, or how you think about the differentiation piece in more of a regular classroom, perhaps?
Yeah, I think regardless of whether, you're working with a student who is profound on the spectrum or sort of at that higher end of the spectrum, two things have really come to mind and have worked really well, and especially with the teachers that I work with at Shrub Oak. And one of those things is presuming competence. So regardless of how a student is presenting, whether a student is verbal, nonverbal, aggressive, non-aggressive, able to communicate in their own ways, I think presuming competence is really the main thing that teachers should do, because just because a student is not necessarily speaking to you or communicating to you doesn't mean that they're not understanding sort of their world around them. They're just understanding it in a different way. And it's sort of our job as teachers to jump into their world and sort of try to experience the learning environment in the ways that they're experiencing it to better sort of help them towards a world of independence. So really, presuming competence is one of the main things that I always tell the teachers at Shrub Oak when I'm working with them and supervising them is don't just assume that, they're not interested in the world around you or are understanding the world around you. They're just interested in understanding it in a different way than you and I are. And then the other thing is relationships. I find that if you form positive, respectful, lasting relationships with students, and of course, this doesn't just go for students on the spectrum, this is just students in general. The world in the classroom is a lot different. I find that really jumping into what students are interested in and making that a part of their curriculum is the most engaging thing you can do for a student. So if a student is interested in a different kind of video game, adding that video game into their math program or their English program, and really hooking them in and getting them to learn about the things that we as teachers want them to learn about, and we know it's important for them to know, but also is meaningful for them. I think really having that relationship and creating a meaningful back and forth with them around the things that we're interested in and the things they're interested in is really paramount.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the competent, I think that sort of presuming competence and building relationships, I think both of those things would transfer to any classroom, or should at least, right? Sort of the thinking about students and how we relate to them and view them. I'm wondering, when you think about being able to demonstrate understanding, and students who struggle to do that, and many mainstream students struggle to do that in ways that teachers are expecting them to do. So that's one struggle, right? That we think about just in mainstream classrooms of how do we help students demonstrate that they understand and know and have sort of got what we're teaching in a crude terminology. So what are some of the ways in which you have teachers or suggest your teachers get students or provide opportunities for students to demonstrate that understanding and that competence?
Yeah, I think we kind of we have the luxury of doing this at Shrub Oak, but it doesn't necessarily mean that other educational environments don't. Is taking it outside of the classroom. So one of the things that we work on is money skills. So not necessarily just working on money skills inside the classroom, but actually having students feel real money, look at real money, understand it in a very practical way, and then also go out in the community and practice using money. I think providing students with opportunities to practice things in real life situations and not just pen and paper can make it more practical for students. Obviously, students on the autism spectrum, most of them are visual learners. So not just providing that auditory input, but providing that visual input as well, and really getting to know students' sensory systems and how they learn best. Are they tactile learners? Then that's how we have to teach them. And that again goes for students on the spectrum, but it can also go for students in general education as well, really learning how they learn. Do they learn through movement? Do they learn through touch? Do they learn through smell? And then how can we sort of change our practice so that way they really pick up on the content that we're teaching and understand it in a different way that they might not have been able to understand it if they were just sitting at a desk using a pen and paper, sort of that sort of old school way of teaching and thinking and learning.
Right. So when you're talking about sort of connecting to the students' interests, and I do believe that that's a really powerful way to build relationships and engage and potentially empower students. But the conflict that creates in lots of classrooms is that it doesn't always match up with sort of the content or standards that we are needing to address or to teach or to build understanding of. And that's maybe more of a reality or a problem or conflict in mainstream classrooms, but maybe not. I don't know if, as you're thinking about the student population you're dealing with, if there's a different set of outcomes that you're looking at that reduces that friction as opposed to, let's say your mainstream classroom.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of comes back to incorporating the students' interests in anything you're doing. So again, like you said, we have standards that we have to meet, but it it doesn't necessarily stop us from incorporating their interests and passions into those standards. So if we're working on reading comprehension, changing the books that students are reading or the content that students are reading to things that they enjoy. So if they enjoy animals, making it about animals to try to really teach and learn those basic concepts of reading comprehension in a way that they can reach. Same for math. If we have students and we're trying to teach them certain aspects in math, we have some students that if they're still learning basic addition and subtraction and they like to move their body, okay, count how many steps it takes you to get to this place, and then add it to the amount of steps it takes you to get back to the classroom, really adding those different creative ways. And it's not necessarily not reachable to the standard. You can still connect it to the standard, but just doing it in more of those modified and creative ways.
Mm-hmm. How do you think about, or what's your opinion of the sort of different learning styles? Because it's feels like you're sort of brushing up against that in some ways, but not necessarily. And there's been significant pushback on this idea that there are no learning styles, or that's sort of a myth.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think every student learns so differently, and it's important for teachers to really understand how they learn. We have a lot of students, especially in the autism world, their sensory systems are so impacted by their environment. So making sure that you're adapting the classroom to their needs from a sensory perspective. So whether it's, the feel of something, or it's the seat that they're sitting in, or it's the auditory input that's coming from outside of the classroom, changing the location based on the auditory input. I think all of those things come into play when we're teaching students, and making sure that they really have the environment available to them to even access the content, because if they're not regulated and they're not engaged, then they're not learning. So really us figuring out those learning styles and how they learn, and what is really changing the environment around them in order for them to best learn is really important. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think you have to really understand a student and the whole student from every different perspective in order to be able to get them to a state where they are regulated and engaged to even access that content.
Yeah, we talk about it often in terms of learning preferences, and some of it could be semantics, and the idea that we have somebody who might be a visual learner and prefer that kind of knowledge intake process doesn't mean that everything has to necessarily be in visual format, right? That there are different ways in which they certainly can take information in, and maybe that those differences and those preferences are magnified with somebody who has autism. Maybe not. I don't know how that works. I lean into your expertise on that, but it seems like we all have preferences in the ways in which we prefer to take information in, but that doesn't mean that we're limited to those pieces. So to that extent as well, are there sort of hard and fast rules that you use with students who have autism, or are there differences within those students on the autism spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely hard and fast rules, but one of the things is autism is not a one size fits all approach. You can never, I don't know if you've ever heard that quote, but basically two people with autism, I forget exactly what the quote is, but it's basically stating that there's no two people alike with autism. And that could be said for everybody. There's no two people who are exactly alike in any sense. But sure. Basically, there's no real broad range. I think you really have to get to know each individual student and find what techniques work with each student, and also get to know their educational background. I think especially for our high school age students, we get them at 14, 15, 16 years old, and they've had a whole range of educational experiences that are either more likely than not negative, but also some positive ones, in understanding what's worked in the past. I think for students with autism, it's not trying just one modality. For students, if you're trying to educate them and you're doing it auditorily, also writing it to them, understanding it from a visual perspective as well as an auditory perspective. Slowing down is always a hard and fast rule when it comes down to working with students with autism. Usually their processing speed is a lot more delayed. So really making sure that it's small increments of language going out, and waiting. Waiting is key. Making sure that students really, really understand what you're saying or doing before you move on to anything. Because I think sometimes students with autism present as though they are understanding what you're saying and processing what you're saying, but need a little bit more time. And that can be hard for some teachers to really wait and sit, and especially sitting in silence, and making sure that students are accessing that information. And I think that's really, really important, because we do have a lot of students too at Shrub Oak who their processing speed is delayed, and making sure that we're slowing down what we're doing and making sure that they're understanding the content before we're moving on.
Yeah, that wait time is really difficult. I joke about it in our workshops because we want to do that with adults as well. We don't like that silence just naturally, so we want to fill that silence. And I think lots of teachers and professional development facilitators and adults do that, and parents do that. We struggle to have that wait time. I sort of joke about it as the awkward teacher wait time, just to make it sort of less awkward. But that is a really important piece of how do we help students of any ability or adults of any ability to process and think, and not be, just because we're teaching doesn't mean that the learner is learning or thinking. So we have to shift that focus to their thinking, not just our teaching. And I think that's a really easy mistake to make.
Of course. Yeah, I always think about it. If you are explaining something to a student and they're silent because they're processing that information, and you don't wait until you get something back from them before you say the next thing or before you repeat it, you start all over again. So if you're explaining instructions and a student, especially on the autism spectrum, is processing that information, and then you interrupt it by either repeating it, that process starts all over again. And then they have to reprocess all of that information. And that's where a lot of times you see frustration in students on the autism spectrum, because they're not able to communicate to you that they're still processing the first information that came in. And then when we're repeating it again, it's so frustrating to have to go back and process that information again. And that's when we see a lot of that frustration.
It reminds me of, I was having this conversation with my youngest daughter, who's now I've got an 11 and a 13-year-old, and it's a little scary, but as I remember her as a younger child, before her language abilities fully developed, I remember her having trouble with getting frustrated, and I at least thought, certainly there's no way for me to know this for sure, but it felt like she was really struggling to be able to put into words her thoughts, because she didn't have those words yet. They weren't quite available to her. And I'm wondering if that's similar in how autistic students behave or think or process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely developmental, where if students haven't reached that developmental milestone yet of being able to form the words behind the thoughts, then that frustration really comes out. Think about it even just in ways of, if you're feeling pain, sometimes something that just helps you immediately when you're feeling pain is being able to vent to someone that you're feeling pain. So if you have a headache, just being able to tell someone close to you that your head hurts can sometimes make you feel a little bit better. But if you don't have access to that language to be able to tell someone that your head hurts, then that's when you start to see other behaviors where you don't necessarily know that behavior is coming out due to lack of communication due to a headache. So that's a lot of times, that's why when I speak to really getting to know the students, you get to know those little behaviors that happen before something maybe more drastically happens because of lack of communication. And once you're able to sort of provide students with other modes of communication, you see a lot of those behaviors decrease. And a lot of times those other modes of communication come out when relationships form.
Hmm. Well, I do want to get into, because that brings up the difficulty and challenges of doing this kind of thing in online environments. But before we do, I do, if you could, sort of give us the sort of crib notes version of what are the differences between Asperger and autism, and how do you define that spectrum? Because I think there's lots of people, teachers included, who sometimes think that students are perhaps undiagnosed as having autism, and Asperger's has started to become a sort of mild autism in the vernacular, and I don't know if that's absolutely correct. And people say, "Oh, I think they might be on the spectrum," but are we making mistakes there, or how should we be thinking about that with the students in our mainstream classes that we might suspect are having some of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes down to it, autism is really a disorder of relating and communicating. So, a lot of times, regardless of cognitive ability, if a student is unable to relate and communicate to the world around them, that's more often than not when a student is placed on the autism spectrum. So, as far as Asperger's disorder is concerned, a lot of times students with Asperger's possess average or above average intelligence, and that's a lot of times why they are diagnosed with Asperger's disorder. But when it comes down to students who might be at a different end of the autism spectrum, it's usually characterized by delayed intellectual disabilities, communication, sensory integration. So that's really the main thing that sort of distinguishes between Asperger's disorder and autism, is really that cognitive delay. Oftentimes than not, you see the Rain Man is portrayed as being on the autism spectrum. That's more of what you would see as far as Asperger's disorder. And there was a lot of controversy when people with autism started being displayed in media. It was often that other end of the spectrum, just really that, for lack of a better term, high functioning, really, really savant-like skills. And that's not every single person on the spectrum. And it's called a spectrum for a reason, because you might have students who present with really, really above average intelligence. But then you also will have students who are nonverbal and have alternative modes of communication, delayed cognitive ability. So it's really important to really know that at the end of the day, it's a sensory disorder. So regardless of whether someone is higher end of the spectrum or lower end of the spectrum, their sensory system is impacted. And that's really what it comes down to, is understanding those individual differences with each student on the spectrum, because then you get to understand their sensory system a little bit better, and what are the things that affect them and what are the things that help them.
And how does the role of emotions and emotional processing play into that? Because I think there's some of that, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think if you're not regulated, so if you're not able to sort of be in a place of regulation, whether it be because, something's too loud outside, or because you don't like the smell in the room, or the light is too bright, that's really going to also hinder your emotional regulation. So it really goes hand in hand. The sensory regulation and emotional regulation really go hand in hand, because oftentimes if someone can't regulate their sensory system, then they're not emotionally regulated as well.
Mm-hmm. And if teachers are working with students who are somewhere on the spectrum, and ostensibly they would be pretty mild in that spectrum, I don't know if that's left or right, or visually what that looks like, but in a mainstream classroom, you would assume that they're not heavily impaired with cognitive or emotional pieces. But are there suggestions or ways in which you might help regular ed teachers think about or respond to those kinds of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would definitely get to know the students' sensory systems and understand what impacts them in the classroom, and then really try to modify the classroom environment based on how that student is presenting. So that might mean a little bit more movement breaks than a typical student in a classroom. They might not be able to sit, they might cognitively be available, but they might not be able to physically sit for 40 minutes at a time. So maybe breaking it up into 15-minute increments. Okay, we're going to do 15 minutes of work, and then we're going to take a 5-minute walking break, and then we're going to come back and do 15 minutes of work, and then we're going to take a 5-minute walking break. I think that's really a key thing, is really understanding the environment and adapting the environment to each individual student. The other thing is just having things available in their classroom environment. So whether that be some type of fidget or sensory toy that they can use in their hands to feel a little bit more at peace with their environment. Also changing the seating. So for some students, it might mean having a therapy ball as a seat in the classroom, or having the opportunity to be present in the classroom, but pacing back and forth. For some students, they're just not able to sit down. So really providing those opportunities for them to be able to access the content just like any other student in the classroom.
Right. And I would imagine an emphasis on patience, and reminds me of thinking about how teachers generally just sort of a disposition of recognizing that sort of middle and high school students, especially early high school students, maybe are as any teenagers, they're sort of prone to emotional reactions and swings, and thinking about how you respond to those kinds of things in ways that are a little more even-keeled and not reactive, and sort of matching fire with fire, which is very much easy to say but not easy to do. Does that make sense as well?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I think if they're not learning in the way that we're teaching, then we have to completely change the way that we're teaching.
Yeah. Okay. So with the online learning sort of push now, the place in which we are with COVID-19, the pieces in which teachers are having to engage students, as I said earlier, as you said earlier, really being able to take some of those visual cues and read students is increasingly more challenging. So what are some of the things that you have seen as successful in this online learning environment with your students and students like yours?
So I think, and this doesn't just go for students on the spectrum, I think this really goes for everybody right now, is really understanding each family's situation, because we have parents who are on the front lines right now, and we can't be expecting the parent to be next to the student all day, every day, helping their student access content, because that's just not a possibility for them. So having some type of empathy towards each family's specific situation is, I find, very, very important, and really taking the time to talk to each family and understanding what's going on at home. What do they have access to at home? Some students don't have access to Wi-Fi. So being able to sort of figure out different ways to educate them given this situation. As far as students on the spectrum, it's really a lot of social stories. For a lot of our students, they don't understand why they're home right now. They know, for some of them, they know it's a virus, but they don't really understand. They know that there's been viruses before, and this hasn't really happened. So we've been utilizing social stories to really just have them understand, okay, why is it that I am home and doing school at home? For a lot of our students, home is home and school is school. And it's very, very confusing to sort of integrate the two. So really making sure that they have a deeper understanding of why they are home and what is going on in the world right now before we even try to access any other content. And I think too, what's something that's really been helpful is just having video sessions with no agenda. So I have a few teachers who's been setting up sessions online with multiple students at a time, and there's no agenda. It's just a matter of having the teachers interact with the students interact with the teachers, the students interact with each other, their families interacting, and just simply being and trying to just put a smile on their faces during this completely uncertain time. I think that's been really helpful for our families and our teachers and our students, because they know that time there's nothing expected of them. They just can be who they are during this absolutely insane time where everything is so uncertain around them.
Mm-hmm. Are there things that you expect, or I guess if you're thinking about how you know if your teachers are doing great work before or during this kind of situation in which we find ourselves, but just demonstration of really good teaching, how do you, I'm curious if you are, when you evaluate teachers and as you think about them evaluating themselves and, you know, sort of the rubric or the indicators of really good teaching and learning going on, if they're much different and in what ways they might be different from a more traditional school, how do you know and how do your teachers know if they're doing great work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things that we do at Shrub Oak is we have weekly teacher supervision. So teachers are not only evaluated and observed during, once a year or twice a year, like they are in other schools. So they're constantly, there's a big presence between myself and the other education administrator who we're in the classroom a lot. So we're able to sort of teach our teachers in the moment and really mentor in the moment, and also have that time to just sit down and think about everything that's going on, go through every student, go through every class, and really talk about what are the ways that students are accessing learning and what are the student ways that they're not, and how can we change it. And I think that's been really helpful for the teachers and also really helpful for me to have that time set aside to really sit down with each teacher weekly and talk about what's going on inside the classroom, and then also following that up by having time inside the classroom to really see it for myself as well. So that's really been a huge step as far as seeing kind of that understanding of students, but also really being able to mentor teachers in the moment and actively throughout the school year, not just at the beginning of the school year and at the end of the school year. It's made a huge difference.
And in that process, then, what are some of those like indicators or ideals that you're after, or some people call them standards? Like, what are those sort of statements that you might say this would be an indicator that they're doing really great work?
Yeah. So basically, there's a few different domains that I really look for. So, creativity, as far as the way that they are changing their teaching practice for different students in the class. That's one thing that I'm always looking for. Appreciation for diversity, whether that be cultural diversity, religious diversity, race, socioeconomic status, making sure that teachers are taking all of those things into consideration when teaching. And then for students on the autism spectrum specifically, I always look for how it's being related to their transition outside of school. So what is, basically, for lack of a better kind of statement, what is the point? So you're teaching this to this student, but how is this going to help this student succeed and be independent post 21 years old? And if a teacher isn't able to sort of tell me why they are teaching that or what the point is, then we shouldn't be teaching it. Then we should really be changing what we're doing, because our whole point in autism education is making sure that students are being as successful as possible post 21, because there's not a lot of opportunities post 21, and we want to make sure that we give them the best education possible in the time that we have them. So if we're not doing something that's really meaningful and is really going to help them with their independence, with their daily living skills, with their life skills, accessing post-secondary education or accessing a job after 21, then we shouldn't be doing it. So that's one of the main things I always bring it back to is, why are you teaching what you're teaching? What is this going to help a student do post-21? And how can we change it if it's not?
Yeah, that's very powerful. And that's, I ask teachers the same in our workshop, like, why is this important? And as listeners are familiar, we do lots of work in project-based learning. And as a side note, I'm curious if and how much you might engaged in project-based learning with your students, and how appropriate that is for autistic students. But as we think about trying to do authentic work with students, the question often comes to, why is this important? Why should students know this or understand this, and how do adults use this? And of course, there's a different translation to just independence and more basic life skills and, as you said, career competencies. But it's a really important piece to keep in view, right? And as we think about the why, like, how is this important? And if it's not, then of course it could be, and they're just not able to articulate it as teachers. But if it's not really that important, or if adults aren't using it, then is there real value in that? And it probably does make more sense to be pretty strict about that with autistic students, because it is about that independence. I mean, there's certainly some things that regular ed students learn that they may not use in their adult life that there's some value to, but the independent skills and life skills are probably it makes more sense to focus on that. So do you all use much project-based learning or inquiry-based learning or constructivism or that kind of thing?
Yeah, we definitely, we started actually recently implemented a project-based learning program. And the point of that for our students specifically was we are a transdisciplinary program. So we have an education department, we have a clinical department, and we have a campus life department. And the campus life department is really our residential side. So making sure that all three of those departments are working in conjunction towards each student's goals and objectives. So the purpose of our project-based learning program was really to be able to not only use the goals and objectives that we set forth for a student in our education department, but also what are their clinical goals. So being able to have students work together and working on one project that's really looking at their sensory goals, their behavior, social, emotional goals, their communication goals, and then adding some type of academic component in it has been really, really helpful for our students. So we had students recently do an egg drop challenge where they had to work together to create a box and a compartment that basically kept an egg safe when they dropped it from a certain distance. Mm-hmm. So they all had to work together to create this contraption that kept this egg safe, and so it didn't crack. And so again, it incorporated, social skills and communication skills and regulation skills. There was some math involved. There was some reading involved. There were a lot of different avenues to really go down, and it was kind of tailored towards each individual student. So that's one of the project-based learning activities we did recently. And then we also had, when it was snowy, like I said before, we're on 127 acres, so we have some pretty good hills on campus. So we had the students work together to be creating sleds. So they actually created the sleds from scratch and then actually went out in the snow and practiced. And then if it didn't go down the hill, then went back into the classroom and figured out how they could change it to make it work. So we definitely implement a lot of that project-based skill for the purpose of really integrating clinical goals as well as education goals, and then really transferring it over into our campus life program as well.
Right. So I would make a distinction, especially with the egg drop. I would probably call that problem-based learning, because as I distinguish project and problem-based learning, I often think about the authenticity and the authentic audience. The sled thing sounds a little bit more like it could be project-based versus problem, because there is some, I would imagine, some enhanced or at least potentially enhanced meaning or authenticity for the students. And lots of times there are lots of the things that you mentioned, the skill building pieces are happening in both of those. And I'm wondering, when we think about an authentic audience, if there are opportunities, especially for the students that we're talking about, getting them to be prepared for those career competencies and life skills, and engaging with actual people in authentic roles and jobs outside of the school walls, and to the extent that they can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, that problem-based or project-based learning is really working on a lot of skills that you need when you go out and you hold down a job. So being able to do conflict resolution, communicating what you need and what you want, being able to access different academic content, are all different skills that you will use when you're out in the community and holding down a job. Time management. So I think it's a neat opportunity for our students to do it in a fun way, but also sort of learn some of those practical skills that they will need when they do leave school.
Mm-hmm. And then as you think about the connection with the outside world, are there things that are different in professional development that you do for your teachers that might be different? I mean, I would imagine lots of learning and building understanding of autism in general, because I don't know how much they come with, and I would assume that there's always more to learn. But how do you balance that sort of learning about the population that they're working with and the characteristics versus just the sort of straight pedagogy, and how much of a challenge is that in your support of your teachers?
So what we do is we have a transdisciplinary meeting every day. Every single day at the end of the school day, we dedicate an hour where our clinicians, our education staff, and then some representatives from our residential program all meet together. And what we do is we typically divide up into a couple groups, and each group has a student. So we really look at that student not only from the perspective of autism, but what other things are coming into play as far as educating the student. So I think that's been really helpful for every staff member that comes in, because it's a great opportunity to talk about the kids. I find a lot of times in schools, there's not enough opportunity to talk about the day. The day sort of ends and then teachers go home and then you start again the next day. And it's a good opportunity to sort of reflect on the day, reflect on how the student is doing, what are the positives that are happening, what are some of the challenges that are happening, and really teach our staff how to work with each individual kid. So that's one of the things that we do. And then we typically have 2 professional development days throughout the school year. So this year we had a couple sessions by our OT, which focused on sensory regulation, that really went into the nitty gritty of working with students and their sensory systems. We did a trauma-informed care presentation because we do have a lot of students who come from pretty negative school experiences. We've done a dyslexia presentation. That's because we have a few students who have dyslexia. We've had a Tourette's presentation where we've learned a little bit about Tourette's and how that might affect a student on the spectrum, and what's alike and what's different. So really, when we have students come in with sort of these co-occurring conditions and different life experiences, we try to tailor our professional development to meet the needs of those kids. So that way our teachers are as informed as possible when working with those students. So it's not an easy task. It definitely takes a lot of planning and making sure that everybody's available. And sometimes it can be hard after a long day to really meet for that extra hour. But I think when we put in the time and put in the work, it really helps to benefit our students.
Mm-hmm. So I know you were one of the founding teachers at Shrub Oak, and I don't know how long Shrub Oak has been in existence, but I don't know. I'm curious how long you've been the director of education there, but more importantly, what are some of the things that you would say you've really learned as you think about supporting teachers? Because I tend to think about administrative roles or somebody in a director of education, dean or principal kind of role, that it's really something that they should view themselves as support staff, and we want to get away from this sort of boss employee kind of relationship where teachers are somewhat intimidated or nervous about an administrator coming in, and as you mentioned, that sort of standard twice a year evaluation and putting on the dog and pony show. I think that's a worst case scenario, or pretty close to a worst case scenario. But what are some of those things that you have learned in the time that you've been director of education as you think about supporting your teachers?
Yeah, so Shrub Oak has actually only been open for 2 years. So
Okay.
I started as the founding teacher last year and then shifted into director of education this year. So it was a pretty quick
So
transition for
long tenure there.
Yeah, exactly. But I think what's interesting is I've always sort of wanted to hold this sort of position. It is what I'm going to do my doctorate in, and it's something I'm very passionate about is mentoring and working with teachers, especially special education teachers. And I think that the biggest thing I've learned as a lot of the things that I do as an administrator are things that I've learned as I was a teacher. And that wasn't just at Shrub Oak, but before when I was a teacher at other placements as well. So some of the biggest things I think that are important is having that open door policy, making sure that teachers feel comfortable to come in at any time to talk to you about anything. And whether that's, I'm writing an email, what I need some help writing this email, or just something about something in the classroom, I think is really important. A level of transparency is something that's been important. I think I found that as a teacher, sometimes there was not a lot of transparency between teachers and administrators. And I think that that's so important. As much information as you can give teachers, give it to them. Because I think it's so important for them to feel included in a lot of the decisions that are happening. And then in saying that, giving them a say in the decisions that happen. I know it's not always possible for a lot of public schools, but being a private school, we have a lot of flexibility in this. So if we're creating a policy or creating a protocol, giving teachers some autonomy over being a part of creating that protocol. I think they're in the front lines, they're in the classrooms, and they're with the students all day, and they know a lot of the things that will work and a lot of things that won't work. So it's really, really respectful and really a great opportunity to involve them in that process. Those are some of the things that I've been really determined to do in this year as a first year administrator, and making sure that my teachers really feel valued and respected and are part of the process.
Yeah, I don't know why that public schools would not be able to do it, but there certainly could be some structural and systemic challenges in doing that. What are, I guess, conversely, what are some of the things that teachers often, I guess, as you've made this transition, because teachers often think, and lots of folks think, my mom was a former principal, and she at one point said, "You should be a principal." And I said, "You got to be out of your mind. You got every single stakeholder's coming at you with requests and expectations, and they have this sense that you have all this autonomy to do anything you want, but that's not really the case." So are there big takeaways that you say, boy, teachers really don't, or maybe you as a teacher didn't understand or have a sense of some of the limitations or the realities of being an administrator or in a leadership position?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think I've reflected a lot about this during this COVID crisis, is especially about the autonomy, is what you kind of explained. I think when I was a teacher, I didn't realize how much really falls on the administrator, and how you do have a lot of say in a lot of the decisions, but you don't have say in every single decision. So I think one of the most difficult things is really portraying decisions that are made to teachers that you didn't necessarily make. But I think it's important for you to feel strong, regardless of whether you made that decision or not, to be able to articulate that to teachers and why it's important. And that's definitely something that is difficult but important. I think, like you said, as a teacher, you don't realize I actually had a former administrator tell me it's lonely at the top. And I don't necessarily fully agree. I think you don't necessarily have to make it doesn't have to be lonely, but there are times where it is, and making sure that you have the teacher's respect from day one. So I think if you have the teacher's respect, even if they don't agree with the decision that you're going to make or that you are making, they have some faith in you that you're doing it for a reason. Yeah. So that's always helpful.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to the relationships part. I mean, there's certainly, you can approach it from an authoritarian sort of standpoint, and you can have sort of some sort of respect, although it's based on fear, and I think there's a real limit to that. But when you are clear and transparent with teachers and include their voice, but be clear here, like, okay, so we're all going to have a voice here, but there has to be a decision maker, and sometimes that decision may not be consistent with exactly what you want to happen, but I do think that there's a level of respect. Thinking about our leadership, whether it's in schools or whether it's in politics or whatever, we don't necessarily need them to be infallible. And we'd love for leaders to be infallible, but that's not reality. That we all make mistakes, but having that humility of being able to recognize that you may be wrong and you may have been wrong, and we're going to move forward and try to do the very best we can with all of the voices and stakeholders and all of those pieces is part of that decision-making process. I think most people respect that much more so than the sort of top-down, heavy-hand approach of leadership.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think being able to admit that you're wrong is definitely key.
Yeah.
And also just being able to take feedback from teachers. I think a lot of times in the supervision meetings, I'm talking to teachers about, what can I do for you to help you throughout your day? And I think too, it's just kind of turning it around and not necessarily telling teachers what to do, but also asking what they need from you.
Mm-hmm.
That's been a really nice reflection for me, because it's they're honest and they're transparent because I'm transparent and honest. So being able to hear the things that I can change and things that I can do in order to make it easier and better or different for them is also been really nice.
Yeah, there's a blog piece that I published some time ago that was in response to a tweet that I'd put out. But the idea as an administrator, sort of, again, getting to that support role and building on what you said there, is thinking about how do we make the job of being a great teacher as easy as possible. And that's not to say that we want teachers to have an easy job, because that will never happen in reality. But how do we make it as easy as possible for them to do the greatest work that they possibly can? And building in supports and removing as many obstacles as possible. I think it doesn't make any sense to not do that, but that's a real challenge, and that's a challenge for every school and administrator, and I think especially as we think about how the public views teaching and learning, it's a real challenge as well. A question I wanted to ask earlier that doesn't quite fit as a perfect segue, but it struck me. Because you mentioned literacy and talking about, I think, transdisciplinary stuff. Are there pieces of the sort of reading, writing, math kind of different subjects that autistic students tend to be really better at or struggle with? Do they struggle with math or literacy in particular, or is it just like any other student that they struggle with a variety of different things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar. It's a struggle with different things depending on the student. I think one thing that has been sort of pretty much across the board is reading comprehension is always difficult. And that's mostly because the student who has autism spectrum is seeing the world in a little bit of a different way than we're seeing it. And that's not necessarily wrong. It's just different than how we're seeing it. So the way that we're comprehending things and the way that they're comprehending things are different. So I think a lot of times when it comes down to standards-based education, that can be a little bit more difficult for a student on the autism spectrum than a student in general education. But it's, again, like I said previously, it's just about kind of altering our teaching practice a little bit more to help them understand that content, and also for us to just understand it in a different way.
Mm-hmm. But there's not any sort of processing difficulties that are particular to autistic students that have to do with math processing or reading or writing or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think auditory processing is difficult for every student on the autism spectrum. So regardless of whether you're teaching reading, writing, math, or science, the way that it's being presented is
Gotcha.
Always a little bit more difficult. So sometimes writing the information as well as doing auditory input or no auditory input and just writing the instructions maybe on a whiteboard or a separate piece of paper is sometimes helpful for students to access that content. But definitely that processing is difficult across the board, regardless of the subject.
All right. I want to make sure you have an opportunity to share links. I know you have a website, which is shruboak.org. Any other places or resources that you would like to share or think folks should check out, whether it has to do with Shrub Oak or just autistic and autism education in general?
Yeah, I mean, definitely go to shruboak.org to find more information about Shrub Oak International School and our program, and also learn a little bit more about autism education in general. We do also have a strong social media presence, so we're available on Facebook and also on Instagram as well.
Okay. Do your students have any propensity towards social media in particular?
It depends on the student. We have some students who are on their phones a lot and really like social media, and then we have other students who don't really have an interest in it. So it's very student dependent.
Okay. I didn't know if like I struggle with Instagram because it just doesn't seem to connect with me, and I think about, I wonder if they connect with Instagram because of the visual component perhaps differently or something like that. So it struck me.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a celebration for one of our students yesterday with a bunch of teachers and clinicians, and the students shared the screen, and I have never seen someone move so quickly on a computer. It was actually fascinating. I was like dizzy by the time he was finished because he was just showing so many different features that I didn't even know existed.
That's funny. Okay, well, thanks so much for the time. I think this has been hopefully a helpful conversation for folks who are autistic educators or some version of that, but also hopefully for teachers who are non-autistic educators, because I think some of those lessons certainly apply just in general, but also we have some students in our regular ed classrooms who are somewhere on that spectrum, very likely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.